Hello, I'm Janos Di-Fanteria. Welcome to Janos Di-Fanteria Reads. Over the coming months, I'll be reading selected passages from the author's novels, exploring the real history that inspired them, and occasionally taking a closer look at the extraordinary people and events behind the fiction. Everything you will hear is rooted in genuine history. My task has never been to rewrite history, but to ask what might exist just beyond the edge of what we already know. Today's reading comes from Book 1 in the Temple of Death. Our story begins during one of the greatest engineering achievements of the First World War, the Messines Ridge, the 7th of June, 1917. Last time we had descended below the trenches at Messines Ridge. Today we're deep underground. Today's reading continues from In the Temple of Death. This episode is entitled 0310, when across the Messines Ridge the detonating mines would ensure that a private soldier would carry the single most important intelligence leak in human history, and never understood what he had heard. At 0310 on the morning of 7th of June 1917, the earth would open. 19 mines, more than 500,000 tons of explosive, and one of the largest man-made detonations in history. But a few minutes before the ground shook, a young private soldier heard a conversation he was never meant to hear. He didn't understand its importance. Neither did anyone else. Not for a very long time. Hampton approached the tunnel wall, imitating the position he had seen the officer assume. He grasped the discs, one in each hand, and spread his arms outwards and upwards onto the wall in front of him. He could hear absolutely nothing, and turned with a quizzical look and a slight shrug towards Gillard, who at that moment had caught a glimpse of his pocket watch. Gillard spoke no more, and intimated to Hampton with his arms that he should explore the wall. Harold turned back, still feeling confused and now sweating slightly despite the cold and damp atmosphere. The small stump of a candle flickered ominously, casting shadows across the tunnel to which the young soldier now fixed his eyes. As he did so, he closed them in concentration and moved his arms in sequence in a circular motion, like an out-of-place window cleaner with two chamois. It was nothing more than a distant muffled buzz at first, but as he got used to the geophone, Harold scented the sound and began to think he could discern voices from the other side of the wall. This realization hit him like an electric shock, and his hands jumped back slightly, and he inhaled sharply. He gathered himself quickly, and within seconds he had the sound again, sharp in his ears and now distinct. It was German, that much he was sure. Perhaps a hint of the north. He recognized the twang, and then the words he heard became clear. Harold had picked up German from an early age. This was hardly surprising, as his mother was from Hamburg, a thriving port that had long embraced and conjoined Liverpool's maritime traditions and seafaring families. His father had worked on the docks at Liverpool's busy waterfront for over 10 years and had in that time done his fair share of travel, moonlighting with a merchant vessel that would ply its trade with Scandinavia and with the German Empire. Harold was now focusing on a snippet of a conversation that had been ongoing for some minutes, as it had initially alerted Gillard to the noise. He presumed it was countermining, and at a time so close to zero for the Messines attack, it was a critical, nerve-wracking situation. A few voices were all talking at once, and not concerned with the volume, which surprised Harold immediately. But the subject was not expected. There was no talk of military matters, no matter how trivial. One voice stood out, guttural, commanding, questioning another. Harold strained to take the sentences in, somehow triggered to concentrate, and translated as he listened.
Saudia ist tot,
Sonia is dead? Es ist klar, dass in Rennes Chateau etwas gefunden hatte. It is clear that he had found something in Rennes Chateau. Wann ist gestorben? When did he die? Am 22. Januar. On 22nd of January. Wer hat ihm die Bestatungsriten gegeben? Who gave him the last rites? In Vitepriester in der Gegend sein. Another priest in the area, Jean. Hast du mit ihm gesprochen? Have you talked to him? War natürlich unwillig, mit mir zu sprechen, aber ich habe höchst etwas Interesse gelernt. Of course, he was reluctant to talk to me, but he left out something interesting. Gillard could see that something was coming through as Harold's closed eyes and fixed concentration belayed his companion's lack of comprehension. Gillard glanced at his watch again. It was 0230 hours, and he knew that time was running out. He nudged Harold and, without speaking, shot the question with his eyes. What is it? What can you hear? Harold had opened his eyes and understood the request. He whispered, They're not miners, sir. That was the first true thing he said. He did not yet know it was also the least important. What? Said Gillard. He was perturbed, more so now than previously, and was shaping his mouth to ask another question. But Harold silenced him with a tightened face and a slight shake of the head, and closed his eyes as he heard another voice. This voice was interrupting the conversation across the thin void in front of him. This was different, out of place, and incomprehensible. The voice was English. It was clear and clipped, an officer perhaps. 5 minutes had now elapsed since Harold had caught his first sound in the geophone set. He was astounded and unnerved, but fastened securely to the wall, and he couldn't move if he wanted to. Such was his disbelief. He strained, shifted his position slightly, and zoned in on the voice. I'm late. It was impossible to get across. I had to get it through a sap. What news, Gerhard? It's Sonia. He's dead. Damn it. How? Tell me it wasn't you. No, natural causes. We could do nothing to save him. But the secret died with him, unless he talked to Jean. Who? A local priest. Riviere. Wait. The conversation ceased as suddenly as it had started. What do you hear? Harold pulled away from the wall. There was something about the voice. He had heard it before, he was sure. But more than that, there was the impossible sense that the voice had already known he was listening. He had no time to ponder as Gillard grabbed his arm and pulled him back from the wall. There's no time, Hampton. I'll debrief you topside. Right now we need to blow this shaft. Willis, camouflage, quickly. Knuckles edged away silently, returning quickly with what looked like a 4-foot pipe. This was an improvised explosive device that was normally inserted in a rapidly bored hole beneath or to the side of an enemy shaft. There was no time for boring, and Gillard laid the device against the wall that he had just released Hampton from. I must prime the detonators and ensure the main chamber is wired for firing. Back in 5. Then we blow this thing and run. Questions? There were none. Harold was in alien territory. Knuckles was not. He moved quickly and silently past him and wired the pipe bomb as Gillard moved away down the spare and back into the tunnel to where Captain Francis Thornton was checking the wiring of the main device. This was a big mine and just had to go up with the others. Too much work and too many good men had died down in the dark depths for the tunnelers even to contemplate failure at this point. A few nerve-tingling moments elapsed. To young Harold Hampton, it felt like 20, but it was no more than 5, when Thornton and Gillard appeared at the top of the spur and gave Knuckles Willis the signal to prime the charge and blow it. Harold paused, unsure what he should do, but his faltering lasted only a few seconds as they all dashed up the tunnel as fast as they could go. Up the tunnel and the laddering, Major Henry Hudspeth, the commander of 171 Tunnelling Company, stood nervously waiting for Thornton's return. Only a few hours earlier, he had hurriedly repaired the main explosive chamber at the end of the tunnel, using a dynamite charge fixed hard up against the Amatol boxes. He had lost 3 of his men to gas-drenched ground in the process, as his opponent, Fuzzline, had driven a tunnel through his, preventing access to the main charge. He was concerned that it was rough and ready, but certain it would work. It had to. 19 other officers stood nervously next to their exploders on the mine entrances, watches in hand and gas masks on. The countdown had begun. It was nearly 3 a.m., and the huge artillery barrage had died down. Across the front, hundreds of thousands of infantrymen lay on the ground, weapons in hand, ready for the onslaught. What followed, none of them could or would have wanted to predict, no less imagine. Deep below, as Harold scrambled up the wooden exit shaft ladder with the others close behind him, the camafet blew in the tunnel spare. There was nothing more than a muffled but perceptible thud and rumble. It lasted only a second or two. It was enough to collapse the tunnel and bring down the timbers of the German shaft next to it, trapping those inside. All but one was doomed. The man who had spoken English had started moving away as soon as he suspected that their meeting place had been compromised. The others had remained still, listening, and that was their undoing. He escaped as the timber collapsed behind him, and knowing what was coming, got out as fast as possible. At Spanbrook Molen, Hudspeth stood impassively, seeming removed from the moment, but inside he was impatient to get it done. Panting and exhausted, the others joined him. It was now 03:09 hours on the 7th of June 1917, and all hell was about to break loose. Thornton and his commanding officer stood together, their torches fixed on watchers, as they waited for the second hand to move quickly around the dial for that last interminable minute. All other firing points along the line shared this long moment. Then, in the relative silence of the front right along the line, as commanders shouted, "Down!" and plungers were forcibly depressed, there was a pause. And then the ground undulated like a stormy sea. Some thought the earth began to dance before them. And then the rumbles came, deep, menacing and unmistakable. The earth shattered as millions of tons of earth were disgorged hundreds of feet into the air on the tips of enormous tongues of flame. Clods of earth the size of trucks flew into the now orange and blue sky, spiralling upward in lazy parabolas and then falling into the maelstrom below. Major Hudspeth was relieved, but Kingsman Harold Hampton was horrified. This was without parallel. It was madness. Captain Thornton was just delighted that the bloody thing had gone up. We nearly lost her, he thought. But the old girl wasn't going to miss the show. She didn't. And the crater at Spanbrook Molan was 430 feet across. Anyone in the vicinity in deep chambers or dugouts was vaporized instantly. Plumer's plan had worked, and thousands of troops moved off, their ears ringing, their dry mouths full of soil, and their nostrils stinging with ammonium nitrate into battle. Sapper Thomas Lloyd was to comment later on the strangest sight he had ever seen. As daylight flooded the grim battlefield, the infantry pushed on as Lloyd and the rest of his engineer section came upon a sight that astounded them all. Deep within the crater, exposed upon a ledge, sat 4 German officers at a table. One stood against the wall, still smiling, it seemed. The concussion from the blast had killed them all. What you've just heard combines 2 remarkable stories. The first is entirely historical. At 0310, on the 7th of June 1917, 19 of the 20 mines prepared beneath Messines Ridge were detonated simultaneously. Around 500 tons of high explosive lifted the ridge into the sky. The blast killed thousands of German soldiers almost instantly and opened the way for General Plumer's attack. The second story is the fiction that sits quietly inside that very real moment. What if, just before the explosion, someone had overheard a conversation that was never meant to survive the morning? That question became one of the foundations of Ursus. When the mines exploded, the men who had spent almost 2 years digging them received very little recognition. Yet without their patience, without their silence, without their remarkable skill, the Battle of Messines could never have succeeded. It remains one of the greatest feats of military engineering in history. And for me, it provided the perfect moment for history and fiction to meet. A question for you. If you had been Harold Hampton, would you have told anybody what you had heard? Or would you have assumed it was simply the confused conversation of men about to die? This episode concludes our visit to the Messines Ridge. Look out for the next episode of Janos Di-Fanteria Reads, when we will travel back to an event that resonated throughout history. For a detailed dossier on the Battle of Messines, go to detonated.com, the reading room, and pick the volume from the shelf. All of the detail is in there for you to explore. Until next time, thank you for joining me in the reading room. I am Janos Di-Fanteria, and this is Ursus. If you want to see all 3 of the Janos Di-Fanteria Reads podcasts, just go to the Ursus reading room and scroll down to the repository. They're there on the shelf waiting for you. Until next time.